Hey guys, Zach here. This video is a giant compilation of a bunch of different Therian and Furry crafts I've done over the year. And I've decided to compile them into one giant video. So I hope you guys enjoy, and feel free to tag me if you do any of these crafts. Alrighty, with that out of the way, let's customize a notebook. As you may have seen me doing in the background, I've placed a piece of paper over my notebook. And all you've got to do to secure this is tape it down. For right now, we're not going to put any tape on where we're going to be drawing because the marker won't show up as good if you do. But once we're done with the art, we will come back to that. I prefer to just use regular old packing tape. Alright, once you've got your piece of paper taped down, we can start designing our notebook. If you really like this design, you can absolutely copy it. This design is free to use for everyone. As you can probably see in the background, we're just drawing out some nice little vines. I did them very curly and whimsical and all over the place. But feel free to do them however you choose. After that, we're going to go back in with the same color Sharpie and go over all the lines we did to add more depth to the vines. And while we're at it, we're also going to add little stems coming off the vines so we can add some leaves later. Now, take a slightly lighter color green Sharpie and start drawing little leaves on all the vines. I'm just doing pretty basic leaves with little lines on them, but feel free to get as complex or simple as you'd like. Next, to decorate the top of the notebook, I'm going to scribble in some Sharpie. I decided I wanted to make it look scribbly on purpose, but if you don't like that, you can make it a box as well. Next, I'm going to go in with a white paint marker and add some paw prints. If you don't have a white paint marker, that's okay. You could go in with a different colored Sharpie or just leave blank spots for you to add them later. Personally, the way I draw paw prints is I draw 3 circles, 1 on top and 2 connecting at the bottom. And then I just draw little dots for the paw pads. I also feel that the first 2 outer paw pads should be lower than the top 2 ones. I feel like that makes it look more realistic. Next, I'm going to draw the Therian symbol. Of course, this is completely optional. If you're not a Therian, you do not have to draw it. Or on the other hand, if you're other paw or other link or other kin, you can draw that symbol as well. This is your notebook and you should customize it to whatever makes you feel the most happy. And then we're going to finish it right up with some more paw prints. I feel that when you're doing the paw prints, if you make one leaning one way and then one below it leaning the other way, it looks best. So for this one, I actually did the same thing, but flipped it in reverse, so it looks extra cool. Basically, the top ones are pointing away from each other, and the bottom ones are pointing towards each other. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is draw a fox, but apologies in advance, I didn't realize I was off camera for part of this. So just imagine I'm drawing a fox there. Woo, so cool, I'm such a good artist, yay! So I'm drawing a curled up sleeping fox. Now, I'm not a Therian myself, but I just think foxes look cool, so I drew a fox. But if you have a different Theriotype, feel free to draw yours, or if you're not a Therian at all, draw whatever makes you happy. Again, I'm so sorry you guys can't see this. I promise in just a few seconds you'll be able to see me doing it. It's just really, really silly right now. There we go, I finally realized that I'm supposed to be doing this on camera! Anywho, this is me coloring in the fox. I decided to do the outline in a dark orange and start adding lighter orange on the inside. I did, however, do the face in dark orange because I think it makes it pop out more, and it really makes you focus on the face. And after that, optionally, I decided to add little fur markings in the dark orange. I feel this adds a lot more detail and really makes the fox look a little more realistic. After that, I'm coloring the paws black. But I did run into a slight issue right here around the nose because the nose is also black, so it kind of makes it hard to see the nose. I did find a solution to this. I went ahead and took my white paint marker from before, and I just drew around the nose and added little nostrils too while I was at it, and I feel like that fixed it pretty well. I also added little lines for the toes on the paws as well. And after that, all that's left to do is add your information on the front. Like I said, I don't go to school anymore, so I will not be using this notebook. But I did add my name and a random subject just as an example. And would you look at that, a lovely notebook. And while I did write math homework on the front, this could really be used for anything. Things like sketchbooks or a Therian journal all could use this method. This last step is completely optional, but if you want to do it, it'll make it last a lot longer in the long run. but I added some layers of tape on top just for durability and also to make it slightly water resistant. And when I say water resistant, I do not mean waterproof. I mean resistant. Water could still probably get in, but it would be a lot less damage than if it had nothing. Now on to our second craft. This craft is a keychain that looks like a cat mask. To start out, take a piece of cardboard and a Sharpie and start sketching out a cat face. It just needs to be an outline. It doesn't need a lot of detail yet because all of this is going to be covered up. Once you're happy with the sketch, you can take a pair of scissors and start cutting out the cat. Once you have this, we can move on to step number 2. Since this is going to be a keychain that will probably be in your backpack, there's a chance rain might get on it. To make it water resistant, we're going to cover it in tape. Now this won't make it waterproof, it'll only make it water resistant. That means it'll be a little harder for rain to get in, but it will not be able to be submerged. For this method to work as best as possible, be sure to cover both front and back of the cat. I find packing tape works the best for this, but any tape will do. After that, we're going to draw on our eyes with Sharpie. Technically this part is optional, but it gives it a lot more depth. Next, we're going to cut out the eyes. I personally used a box cutter for this because I am an adult and I know how to use it properly. If you're younger, please use scissors or get an adult to help you. Box cutters are very sharp and are not a toy, and you could seriously injure yourself if you do it the wrong way. So please, please, please get an adult to help you. Our next step in this craft is felting. We're just going to take our hot glue gun and cover half of the cat in hot glue. Then we're going to take a piece of felt that is much bigger than the size of the cat, and we're just going to flop it right on there. Once that part is stuck on there, we can go ahead and flip it over and peel back the felt a little bit and do the other half. Once you have that, we're going to flip it over and start trimming away the excess felt. When you're cutting the felt, do not trim straight along the edge, leave a little bit left over. Trust me, we're going to need it for the next step. Once you're finished trimming, apply a line of hot glue onto the felt that we left over. Once you've got your hot glue on, then we're going to fold over the felt onto the back of the keychain. Once finished, the front of the keychain should look like this. This next part is the most tricky. Using a pair of scissors, cut a line in the inside of the eyes. After that, apply a little bit of hot glue onto the eyes and then push them from the front inwards. This will help give it a more seamless look on the front of the keychain. But if you find this process too difficult, you can just cut little holes where the eyes should be. Once you've done that, the front should look like this. This next bit is optional, but I'm using a polymer clay nose to attach to the keychain. If you don't have any polymer clay, feel free to use felt or even just draw one on with Sharpie. Speaking of Sharpie, now it's time to draw on the mouth. I'm using a permanent black Sharpie to do this, but you can also use acrylic paint. But it does take a lot longer to dry. Once you've finished adding all your details, we can move on to the next step. Now it's time to add the elastic. Take a small piece of elastic and glue it together in a loop. Then apply some hot glue to the back of the keychain. Glue on the elastic with the loop part facing outwards. Next, take a piece of felt big enough to cover the entire keychain. Just like we glued on the front felt, we're going to glue on the back felt the same way. Once you've done that, it should look like this. Next, we're going to trim the rest of the felt. Unlike the beginning where we left some extra, we're just going to cut it all the way around. Be extra careful not to cut the elastic loop. Unfortunately, I messed up and my elastic came undone. But it was a blessing in disguise because now it's easier to put on the keychain. I originally was just going to feed it through the normal way, but this is a bit easier. I just fixed it by gluing it back on when I was done. This time I decided to add a piece of felt for stability so it wouldn't come undone again. The next and final step is to do the eyes. I just use a Sharpie to color them in, add some pupils. But if you want, you can also cut out the eyes and leave them open like a fake mask. I also used a paint marker to add some highlights, and then I also decided to draw on a Therian symbol. Again, I am not a Therian, but I just thought it would be fun. Here you can see me just doing some touch-ups, adding a little extra detail. And after that, you're done and can attach it to your backpack. Alrighty, the final tutorial is going to be how to make a candy single. I know this isn't exactly exclusive to back to school, but I still think it's a fun idea. And candy is always a fun accessory. Alrighty, let's get into it. The total number of beads, including charms, letters, and pony beads, should be 30 altogether. But if you have a slightly smaller or bigger wrist, I would size up or down by 2. To start, I'm going to get all my letters. I personally chose to spell out the word Therian, again for all my Therian viewers. And for this bracelet, I'm using cord elastic, and we're just going to start putting on our letters. A common way people mess up the letters is they put them on backwards by accident, so while you're making this, make sure your letters are facing the right way and they're not being messed up in some way. When I put on letters, I don't cut the elastic yet, I leave it on the roll. This way the beads won't all fall off if you accidentally drop it. But now that we do have our letters on, I am actually going to go ahead and cut this now. I find it a lot easier to tie the knot when I have way more elastic than I actually need. Once you've done that, you can start putting your beads on in an alternating pattern from green to black. Of course, you can use any colors you want, but that's just the colors I'm using today. Once you get to the final bead, we're going to add on our charm. If you don't have a charm, just add one color in between that doesn't match the colors around it, so it keeps the pattern. And after that, we're going to tie it off. I prefer to do 3 or 4 knots. It may make the knot more bulky, but it's worth it to not have a bracelet break. I've personally never had one break, so I can safely say it works. The final step is to cut off the extra tails. And then boom, we have our candy single. This is a pretty cool bracelet if I do say so myself. And honestly, candy is such a good accessory to help find new Therian friends. And with that, that's the end of this tutorial. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Start off with the easiest, most beginner-friendly tail. For this tail, we're going to be using materials that I'm sure most of you probably have laying around. All you're going to need is tape, paper, Sharpies, and some scrap fabric. But honestly, you could probably just use crumpled up paper instead of scrap fabric as well. To start, just sketch out the rough outline of your tail. You can see me adding fur spikes here, but later on I decided to abandon those. But you can still add them, of course. In this step, you can add all the different details, colors, patterns to your tail that you like. It's very important that you do this before moving on to the next step, because once we go to the next step, you cannot go back. Be sure to draw a tail on 2 pieces of paper, because we're going to need 2 different halves of the tail to complete this craft. You can see here that I decided to make my tail blue, which isn't exactly realistic to any specific animal, but I do think it looks cool. Once you finish designing and coloring your tail, the next step is to take packing tape and add long strips along the entire thing. This should only be done with either packing tape or tape that is completely clear. If your tape is only partially clear or cloudy, it won't work as well because it'll hide most of the colors. We're adding the tape all over the tail to sort of laminate it and make it more sturdy. Also, do not cut out the tail before adding the tape. Trust me, it makes it a whole lot easier if you wait to cut out the tail until after you've finished applying all the tape to it. Once you finish applying tape to both fronts of the tail halves, we can start cutting them out. This part's pretty self-explanatory, just cut along the lines until you have 2 tails cut out. After that, we're going to place one of our tails front side down and one of our tails on top of that one front side up. So basically that both of the uncolored sides are touching each other. Then we're going to take the tape and start taping the tails together. You can tape all around the edge to seal it in. But don't close it off completely. Make sure there's a small hole left over because we have to add our stuffing. Speaking of that, it's time to cut out our stuffing. I personally am just using this piece of scrap fabric that I'm trimming down into smaller tufts. But if you don't have that, you could easily just cut up some crumbled up paper and use that instead. Once you have finished cutting up your stuffing, you can start putting it inside the tail. Depending on your material for stuffing, this may be a little difficult. If you find that getting the stuffing to stay inside the tail is too difficult, feel free to slightly tape up the hole to make it smaller. This should help keep the stuffing in. Once all your stuffing has been placed inside the tail, you can tape up the hole. When you're done, the tail should look something like this. Also, you can tape multiple pieces of paper together if you would like a bigger tail. The last step is making the tail attachable to a belt. Take a long piece of scrap paper that is big enough to wrap around your entire belt. Then begin to add tape to the front and back of the paper, just like we did with the tail. I also highly recommend adding 2 to 3 layers of tape. I didn't do that here, but it'll make it more sturdy since this is what's going to be attaching the tail to the belt. Once you finish laminating your paper, make a loop and then tape it together. And the final step is to tape the belt loop to the tail. And when you're done, you have a DIY tail. This next tail is a pretty well-known alternative to real tails, and I'm sure by the yarn you can guess what it is. It's a yarn tail. Now there's multiple methods to doing a yarn tail, one that even includes braiding the center, but we're just going to do the most basic type of yarn tail there is. To start, take your acrylic yarn and make one long strip. Just for the sake of this video, I'm making the long piece of yarn not the same color as my starting piece, just so you guys can see what I'm doing more easily. But ideally, you would want your yarn center or starting yarn to be the same color as the tip of your tail. Once you've picked out the color and length of your starting yarn, you're going to take the first color of yarn and cut a small strip about this big. Then you're going to tie it to the very end of your starting yarn. Make sure when you're tying a knot around it, it leaves 2 even long sides. Then take one side of your white yarn and one side of your starting yarn and tie those together. It might slide around a bit, but that's okay. Then take the other side of your white yarn and tie it in a knot with the blue yarn as well. And finally, take all the yarn together, loop it around your finger, and tie one knot in the center, looping all of it together. This should make a very secure knot that won't come undone. Also, it's actually a good thing that the knot is pretty bulky. It means that the other yarns we tie on won't fall off. The next step is to wrap yarn around your hand over and over and over. Don't do it too tight though, because it can make the yarn different sizes, and it also could damage your hand by cutting off blood flow. Repeat this process until you have a decent sized pile of yarn. Then, very carefully slide your scissors under the yarn and cut. Be very careful that your fingers or skin do not get in the way of this. And if you're very young, please ask an adult to do this for you. Once you have your strands of yarn cut out, begin tying them on the base yarn. If you're doing this for the first time, I suggest only doing it one at a time, but I've done this a couple times, so I'm going to do them 2 to 4 at a time. You can see here that I'm switching colors. I highly recommend having more of the first color than you think you need, because as the yarn falls over it, it will cover at least half of it up. If you find that your second color is too long, you can always trim it down with some scissors. And there we go, we have a small yarn tail. You can of course feel free to stop right here, but if you want your tail to be extra fluffy, you can follow this next step. Take a dog brush and start carefully brushing out the yarn. This step takes quite a while, and I guarantee you your hands are going to be hurting once you're done. Even just in this tutorial, I didn't brush out the entire thing, I just brushed out the top. But if you want to brush the whole thing out to be fluffy fur, it's probably going to take a while. But with that being said, here is my yarn tail. It's nice and fluffy. I decided to make mine more of a nub tail, but you can make it however long you want. I didn't do this part, but if you want to make it attachable on a belt, feel free to add a clip. All you would have to do is tie it onto the end piece of the yarn. On to the last tail. This last tail is going to be a fake fur tail, also known as a fursuit tail. The materials you're going to need are fake fur, sewing thread and a needle, and some polyfill or scrap fabric for stuffing. To start out, lay your fake fur fabric backing side up. Next, cut out your template from cardboard or sketch it directly onto the fabric. I recommend using a piece of cardboard as a template because then you can repeat it on both sides. Once you've drawn both tails onto the fabric, you can begin to cut them out. Fake fabric cannot be cut like how normal fabric is cut. Instead, it needs only the backing to be trimmed, or else the fur gets cut and it goes everywhere. You can see here I'm using a blade to cut mine, but this can be done with scissors as long as you only trim the backing and go under the fur. When you're done, you should have 2 pieces of fake fur fabric cut out. Next, you're going to want to pin your fabric together. Technically this part is optional, so if you don't have fabric clips, you don't have to do this, but it will make it significantly harder and your tail may come out uneven. Be sure to tuck in the fur as you're adding the clips on. That way when you sew, you don't have any fur caught into the seams. Next, you're going to take your thread and your needle and push the thread through the eye of the needle to start. Once you've threaded your needle and tied a knot, you can begin sewing. As you sew around the entire tail, be sure to remove the clips as you go. I like to sew on one side of the tail and slowly work my way around, and once I've reached the end of the tail, I start over at the beginning on the other side. I decided to sew my tail by hand even though I have a sewing machine because I know a lot of you guys don't have sewing machines, and I wanted to make this tutorial as accessible as possible. Also, while you're sewing this tail, be sure to leave a hole at the very end. We need to reverse this tail back from inside out to right side out, and we're going to need a hole to do that. As you can see here, I finished up one side and I'm about to move on to the other side. Alrighty, right here you can see me tying off the final knot and finishing the sewing portion of this tail. The next step is to reverse it back right side out. This part can be pretty tricky, but be patient, I promise it'll work. And there we go, it's right side out now. The next step is to stuff the tail. Normally you would use polyfill for this, but for me, I'm just going to use some leftover scraps from when I cut out the tail. That way I don't waste a bunch of materials. Once you're finished stuffing your tail, we can go on to the final step, adding a belt loop. Take out a decent sized piece of thick elastic and fold it into a loop. Make sure before you cut it that the loop is big enough to fit around your belt. And then we're going to glue it into a loop. Make sure to use lots of hot glue so it's very sturdy. You can also sew them together if that works better for you. Once you've done that, carefully apply a generous amount of hot glue onto the inside of your tail. Be extra super duper careful not to get any fur caught in the hot glue as it's very hard to fix. Very carefully push in the loop with the loop side facing outwards and glue it to attach it to your tail. Once again, if you are gluing and not sewing, I recommend using a lot of glue so it's extra sturdy. If you're making this tail just to use for yourself, gluing is absolutely fine. It may be a little less sturdy, but it works for the time being. But if you're planning on selling this tail, you have to sew it. Sewing will always be more sturdy than gluing, and if you're making this to sell, you don't want it to break on somebody. And once you're done with that step, your tail is finished. Look at that. Our first craft today is a wonderful notebook for all your drawing and writing needs. The first thing we're doing today is taking some thin cardboard and putting it into our hole puncher. If you don't have a hole puncher, you can just puncture a hole with scissors, but it'll look a little less neat. Be sure to do this with both pieces of identical cardboard. Try your best to line them up with each other so the holes match. Once you have your holes punched and your cardboard lined up, we can move on to the next step. Take out either a bundle of printer paper or lined paper based on whether you're going to be writing or drawing in this notebook. If you're planning on mostly writing, use lined paper. If you're planning on mostly drawing, use blank paper. First, we're going to make sure all the paper is lined up, and then we're going to place our cardboard on top. Try to line up the cardboard with the corner of the paper. And once you've done that, you can begin cutting down the paper to match the cardboard. Once you're done, your paper should be able to be sandwiched inside the two pieces of cardboard without showing on the outside. Once you've done that, we're once again going to take our hole puncher and punch some holes. Try your best to punch the holes in the same spot that it's punched on the cardboard, that way the paper lines up. Once again, we're going to place the paper in between the two pieces of cardboard like a sandwich. Check to make sure the holes on the paper line up with the holes on the cardboard, and if they do, we can move right on to the next step. I decided I wanted to make my notebook a bit smaller, so I'm taking a blade and cutting down the cardboard, but this is optional and you don't have to do it. Next, we're going to take the top piece of cardboard, and we're going to start drawing on our design. Just like all the other designs in my tutorials, this is completely free to use and can be copied. I'm going to start off with drawing a Therian symbol, but of course if you are not a Therian, just like myself, you don't have to draw this part. Similar to my other notebook tutorial, I'm going to add some vines. I don't know, I just like vines. I think they make any notebook look very nature-y and very pretty. After that, we're going to turn our notebook sideways and start scribbling on some grass. I'm using the same Sharpie as I did for the vines, but you could also use a different colored green Sharpie to give it some different colors and some more depth. You can see here I also decided to go ahead and add some dirt. And one of the last things I decided to add was some lovely stickers. I chose a wolf and a fox, but if you don't have these stickers, just feel free to draw them on. And now to finish off the notebook. To do this, I personally chose to use some orange yarn, but any sort of thread or cord will work also. To start, we're going to take our yarn and poke it through the holes, making sure to get through the paper and both sides of cardboard. And then we're just going to tie a simple knot. I highly recommend to do a double or even triple knot to secure this properly. Also, try not to make the loop too tight. If you make it too tight on accident, you won't be able to flip through your notebook very easily. Once you're finished tying the first one, cut off the extra strands and do the same thing on the other side. Again, double knot or triple knot your yarn, cut off the extra threads, and look at that, we can now open and flip through our notebook. And now you can draw whatever you like in your notebook. I decided to draw a little cat and a little paw. Our next craft today is going to be a cardboard framed paw print. To start out, we're once again going to need 2 pieces of identical cardboard. For this first step, we're going to take the top piece of cardboard and use a blade to cut out the center. If you're a kid, either ask your parents for help or carefully use scissors. Once you've finished, we now have the outer frame for our framed paw picture. You might have to go back and make it a bit wider depending on how big you want your picture to be. Our next step is to make the paw print. To do this, fold your hand into a paw shape. Now, add paint onto the fingers where you want your paw pads to be. Make sure to be generous with the paint because we're going to be stamping this onto paper, and if it's too thin, it won't show up very well. Once you're finished, take a piece of blank printer paper and stamp on your paw. When you're pushing down, rock your hands slightly back and forth. This will make sure every corner of the paint gets on. If it doesn't really look how you want it, or some of the paint didn't stick, feel free to go in with a paintbrush and touch it up. Now this next part is completely optional, but I decided to go in and add some text. I feel doing this makes it look less empty and also just better in general. Now I'm not a Therian myself, but I decided to go in and add the Therian symbol just as an example. I also decided to add some little decorations around the paw. These are just little looped squiggles. And the final step of the drawing, I decided to add some claws. To make all the decorations, I just used a black Sharpie, by the way. Now, take the bottom piece of cardboard that's not cut out and apply a thin line of hot glue. If you add too much hot glue, it'll bleed through the paper and be all bumpy and rigid. But on the other hand, if you add too little, it'll dry before you can even get the paper on. So try and go for just the right amount. It may take some practice. Once you've applied your hot glue, center the paw up to the middle of the cardboard and glue it on. This can be a bit tricky because you can't really see where you're pressing, but try and feel around for the cardboard before you glue and make sure the paw is in the exact center, or else it could risk being off-center or cut off by the frame. Once you've glued on your paper, flip it over and take out your scissors. We're just going to take the scissors and trim around the edge. Try and get your scissors as close to the cardboard as possible without actually cutting any of the cardboard. We're just trying to trim off the excess. Once you're done with that, you can flip it over and now we can add our frame. Take the frame and line it up on top of the paper. Be sure to check to see if it still fits before you glue it on. You can see here I've decided to trim down the cardboard just a little bit because you can kind of see the paper poking out through the edge, and we don't want that. When you're cutting off the extra, be sure to only cut off a tiny bit at a time. You can always cut it off, but it's really hard to add it back on. So it's much easier just to be super extra careful rather than having to redo it. Now that I've trimmed my picture to the size I want, I'm going to glue it on the frame. You can see here I'm just lining it up to make sure it fits still. And after that, we're going to apply some hot glue right onto the frame. Continue adding hot glue all over the frame until it's all over every corner. Next, very carefully line up your picture and push down. Be sure that if you're doing this upside down like me, your picture is facing down, so when you flip it over, it'll be right side up. If your picture is a little off center, be sure to move it around before the glue dries. Because if the glue dries, you'll have to peel it off entirely and it risks damaging the picture. For our next and final step to make this a displayable picture, we're going to cut out a stand. I'm just deciding to cut out a triangle, but there's multiple different methods to this. Also, for easier gluing, I'm cutting some slits into the back of the triangle where we're going to glue it down so we can fold them over and glue those instead of just a flat edge. Next, we're going to fold out the cardboard in opposite facing directions so we can glue it down. Next, apply some hot glue to those cardboard tabs we folded out and glue it onto the back of the frame. Try and keep it fully centered or else it won't stand up properly. If it keeps falling over, trim the back of the stand a little tiny bit at an angle so it stands up easier. And once you've done that, we've got our frame! This next craft is probably the easiest one in this video. It's a drawstring pouch. To start out, cut out a large fabric circle. This can be any fabric you want, but I am using fleece. Then, with a pair of scissors, go around the edge and cut tiny holes. Try to cut them as close to the edge as you can without actually breaking the edge. Leave about 1 inch to a 1/2 inch of space in between each hole. When you finish that step, take a long piece of yarn in the color of your choosing. Feed it through the holes going back and forth. When you're done, you can pull the strings tight and it'll close up the pouch. And for a final touch, you can draw a Therian symbol or whatever you'd like on the bottom. I'm using a paint marker to do this, but you can also just use acrylic paint or even Sharpies if it's a light colored fabric. Some good ideas of things you can put in this pouch are soda tabs if you collect them, shiny rocks, little bones, or any other sort of trinket you can think of that's small enough to fit. So, unfortunately, because I've customized part of these shoes before I started making this video, I don't have much footage of me adding the toes, but all you do is use a Sharpie and draw on some toes and claws. This next step is a little more tricky, but we're going to be adding some candy to our shoes. And when I say candy, I of course don't mean the sugary sweets, I mean the beads, also commonly known as pony beads. The colors I'm using today are black, white, and gray, but you can use any color you want. I'm going to start out by putting my beads in this fish plate. That way it'll be easier for me to grab them. I try and keep them in little piles, that way I don't mix up the beads. The next step is to untie your shoes and begin unlacing them. While you're unlacing your shoelaces, be sure to leave the very last lace still intact. Don't worry, we will still be adding beads to that lace. We just want to leave it in temporarily so our shoelaces don't get longer on one side. Once you've unlaced the shoelaces, put your thumb to hold the one end of the shoelace in place and carefully unlace one side. Repeat this on both of the shoes. Then, take the beads of your choice and begin feeding them onto the shoelace. Depending on your size of shoes, it may take more or less beads. If you put on too many beads, you can always unlace that part and take a few off. On the contrary, you can also add more beads on. And if you don't want it to be completely covered in beads, that's okay too. You don't have to put so many beads on that it covers every single part of the shoelace. You can leave some blank spots. But for my shoes personally, I like to add as many beads as possible. Once you have added all your beads onto the first shoe, repeat it on the other shoe. Next, we're going to add some more beads onto the lace again. Once again, you can use as many beads as you want and any colors you want. Don't be afraid to take some off if you think it's too much. Once you've added all your beads, feed the lace through the underside of the hole. That way it pokes out through the top. Then, take your other shoelace and repeat the same steps. When you're done, the laces should make an X. Keep repeating these steps over and over again, adding more beads, poking them through. until you have the entire shoe covered in candy. Once you've added all the beads to the laces and you've run out of holes, do not add any beads to the lace. You cannot tie it if it's covered in beads. And once you've tied up your laces to check that it's perfectly fine, you have finished your candy Converse shoes. Our next craft idea is pretty darn simple. Once again, we're going to use some candy beads, and we are going to make a stereotype themed candy single, specifically a red fox as an example. First, you're going to take your elastic. Do not cut it off the roll, as if you do, you risk the chance of the beads flying everywhere if you drop it. Then we're going to take some letter beads and our rest of our pony beads, and we're going to lay out our bracelet. We want a total of 30 beads. Once you have your beads all properly laid out, we can begin threading them onto the elastic. Starting at the end of the beads we laid out, we're going to one by one feed them onto the elastic. If you're having trouble getting near elastic to poke through the letters, there's one of two things you can do. One, use a thinner elastic cord because that one's too big, or if you can still fit them through sometimes, it means your elastic is fraying and they can't fit through, so all you have to do is trim the end of the elastic, and then they should be able to poke through. Once every single one of your beads is feeded onto your elastic like so, we can trim the cord. And now, the only thing left to do is to tie a knot. To be extra sure the bracelet won't come undone, tie 2 or 3 knots. Then, simply just trim off the extra, and you have a candy single. The third idea today is also candy. Wow, we've been doing a lot of candy stuff. Candy bracelet, candy shoes, and now, a candy possum? Or whatever your stereotype is. But in this case, for an example, I decided to make an opossum. Also, sorry if this video I refer to them as a possum instead of an opossum. Where I'm from, opossums and possums are pretty much the exact same thing, and we all use them interchangeably. Alrighty, to start out, we're going to take one single pink bead and thread it onto our extremely long piece of elastic. You want to cut a lot of elastic. Move the bead down the elastic until it is in the very center. Next, take 2 white beads and feed them onto one end of the elastic. Once you have that, take the other side of the elastic and feed it through the opposite side of the bead, so you have one piece of elastic going out both sides. Then, simply just pull tight. Try not to pull it too tight or else it'll curl up, but also don't make it too loose or else it'll be wobbly the whole time. For our next row, we're going to take a black bead, 2 white beads, and then another black bead. And then we're going to repeat the exact same step that we did last time. Feed them on, put the other elastic through the end, and pull tight. If you can't tell by now, we're making the opossum's face. The pink part's the nose, and the 2 black beads are the eyes. For the fourth row, we're going to take 2 white beads, a gray bead, and another 2 white beads, and then repeat the same step to put it on. Now this next part's a little different. We're going to be making the ears, which is a little tricky, so watch carefully. We're going to put 1 pink bead, 1 black bead, another black bead, and then a pink bead. Now, take the same exact piece of elastic you put the beads on and poke it through the other end that it's going into to loop it around. Then, carefully pull it tight so the 2 pink beads and the 2 black beads are touching each other like a row. Carefully move the beads over so they're touching the head like so. That's our ear. Then, with the other piece of elastic on the other side, repeat the exact same steps. Then we can move on to the next row. For this row, we're going to need 4 gray beads. Then, we're going to continue the neck with another 4 gray beads. Then, we're going to put on 6 gray beads, another set of 6 gray beads, and now we're going to move on to something new, the legs. Take 8 beads and start putting them on your elastic, 4 on each side. When you're done, it should look like this. Then we're going to take 3 pink beads and put them on one end of our leg. Be sure to keep them separate from the black beads. Then, skipping the pink beads, we're going to feed our elastic back through all 4 of the black beads. By skipping over the pink beads, they will curl and bundle up, making the toes. Next, we're going to repeat this on the other side, exactly the same. After that, we're going to go back to our rows and add another 6 gray beads. And then we're going to add another 6 gray beads again, and then again, and then right about now you should be starting to run out of elastic, so we're going to tie some on with a double or triple knot. Be sure to trim off the excess. And before we continue on with our rows, we're going to add some legs. Repeat the exact same steps you did on the front legs with the back legs. Now with our rows this time, we're going to add on only 4 beads, followed by another 2 beads. And now for our last and final step, the tail. We're going to do the exact same thing we did with the body, except with only 1 single bead, repeating over and over until we finished our tail. You can make the tail as long or short as you'd like. It's all up to your personal taste. And then the only thing left to do is tie a knot and trim the excess, and then you are done! Look at this cute little possum. You can tie this onto a backpack, or you can even tie it onto a keychain that can then be put on a backpack. Put it on whatever you like. Our next and final craft is some clay pins. You're going to need some polymer clay, some spare pin backs, some cling wrap, and a tool to sculpt or mold the clay with. I'm using a Sharpie back because I don't have anything. First thing you're going to do is take your cling wrap and wrap over your pin backing. The pin backings cannot go into the oven when you bake the clay, so to get the perfect shape, we're going to wrap it in cling wrap to prevent it from sticking, and then mold the clay on top of the cling wrap. For my example, I'm making 2 different pins, so I'm going to do this twice. Then we're going to take out our polymer clay and knead it until it is very soft. Then we're going to take our clay and firmly but carefully press it onto the pin. Be sure you're pressing the clay onto the side of the pin backing that doesn't have the pointy part, aka the part that goes on your shirt. Be sure to press down pretty firmly to get into all those cracks and crevices. Then we're going to take our Sharpie or other tool and start making our paw print. There's no one right or wrong way to do this, so just keep fidgeting with it until you've got a paw print you're happy with. Once you're done sculpting your pin, or in my case both of my pins, we can remove them from the pin backing to bake. Take the elastic and very carefully unwrap it and pull the pin off the backing. Now, extremely carefully start peeling the cling wrap off of the clay. You want to do this as carefully as possible because we want to preserve the molded shape on the back, so that way when we put it back onto the pin backing once it's baked, it won't get squished and it'll fit perfectly. Once you're done, bake the clay in the oven based on your specific clay's baking instructions. Once you're done, let them cool for about 20 minutes, and then we can glue them onto our pin backings. To do this, simply take the pin backing and apply a ton of hot glue to the back. Then the final step is to simply press it onto the pin backing. If you've done it right, it should be a perfect sealed fit. And with that, we are done. You can put them on whatever you want to. I simply put them on this napkin just to show an example of how they might sit, but you can put them on a shirt or a hat or anything you want. I will note they are a little heavier than normal pins, so you might have to put them into the fabric like twice, like fold it over a couple times to get them to sit right. But they're pretty cool. They look like little paw prints in the mud.